Welcome everyone. It's Tuesday and it's time for our sew along. So today we're going to be doing a block 35. It's called Hidden Blossoms, and I'll show that to you in just a second. So first of all, tonight's block uses the Tucker trimmer and the corner beam, and we're going to be talking about that. And we're also going to use a couple of techniques that are a part of the technique sheet series, and we'll talk more about that as well. So this is our block. It's called Hidden Blossoms because those corners are going to have the appearance of tulips. Now, of course, there's always more ways to set your pieces than I show you. Um, some of them I haven't even dreamed up yet, but you don't have to arrange your pieces in the same arrangement I have here. So we'll be using the corner beam tool to make the sliver technique, and we'll talk about that. We'll also be using the Tucker trimmer to make shaded 4-patch units in 2 different color combinations. And of course, you can use all different color combinations that I've used. You don't have to stick with my coloring, but I'll try to make it clear when I'm explaining the process what pieces go where so that you can decide how you want to color yours. Now, when we're doing the sliver technique, there is a left and a right, and that's important. Even more so if you're only using one or the other. But when you're using both, it's a little easier when you have an equal number of both, because you can stick with just making sure you have a mirror image and you'll be fine. I chose to just alternate the corners and the triangles on my shaded 4-patch and change the color on the small triangles, and I'll show you how I did that. So first of all, let's talk about the sliver technique. I'm going to put this aside. Sliver is a technique sheet that's available, and the technique gives you a level of difficulty indicator up here, plus the corner beam icon and a sizing chart. And it also talks about how to make sure you have one that leans left and or one that leans right, depending on which way you need your piece to be. So for the first part of the sliver technique, you're going to be making a half square. So I wanted to just review the chart with you. So the Tucker trimmer chart shows the 3 basic units that you make with the Tucker trimmer. And one is the half square unit, the second row is the combination unit, and the third row is the hourglass unit. For our purposes of our sliver, we only are doing the top row, the half square units. Now, on a half square, if you're making a half square for a specific project, you would add 1 inch to your finished size. That's not necessarily true when you're using this as the starting step for a sliver unit. So the instructions are going to tell you what size you're going to need to cut. So I've actually already started the process, and I've got parts of it made. I'm going to move this out of my way for a minute. So we need to make sure we have a right and a left, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. You're going to buddy up your squares, and I've got some light blue squares and some background squares. I've got them laying face to face, and I've drawn my 2 lines. I've stitched on the lines, and now I'm ready to cut. So I'm just going to grab my cutter, and I'm going to cut in between my lines of stitching. And I'll do that with all of them. And I've actually already done that with some of them and pressed them. But I wanted to be able to show you just the process for how we do this. So you're going to take those units, these half square units, and you're going to press them. And I pressed toward the darker fabric. There may be a reason that you decide to press toward the opposite side, which is fine. You also need to know which side of this half square is going to be trimmed away to make the sliver. So I'm replacing a little bit of my blue triangle with a red section. So when I get ready to trim this, I want to make sure that I trim away a little bit of the blue triangle. So this is all explained in the sliver technique. And so you'll want to make sure that you are familiar with that. If you don't own the sliver technique, we do have those available. We can mail those to you, or you can come by and get one. We keep all of the technique sheets in stock, along with all the tools, of course. So I already pressed these. So if I'm using the half square in my unit, I would be ready to grab my Tucker trimmer and line up that diagonal line on the diagonal line on my tool and trim to whatever size I need for this project. For a sliver, you're not going to do this step. You're going to skip this trim step, and you're going to use your corner beam tool to trim away the section that you don't need. And I trimmed away a little bit of this side. So I want to make sure I have the correct number of units that are right leaning and the correct number that are left leaning. So I'm going to stack up my half squares so I can see this already leaning the correct ways, because half of them have to lean to the left, half of them have to lean to the right. So those that are leaning to the left, I'm simply going to take my half square unit and line up the line. I think I'm going to do this with my white cutting mat, because I think you'll be able to see my blue triangles better. I'm going to line that dashed line that says center beam trim number 1 line. I'm going to line it up on the edge, and I'm going to match up the number 3 finished unit. It says cut strips and squares 4 inches. That line is going to go on the base, because this is going to be a 3-inch finished unit when I'm finished sewing. Then I'm going to trim away this part. This is the part I need. This is the part I don't need. So you can either save that or toss it. And you're going to do that same step, line up the 3-inch finished unit on the base, the dash line on the edge, and make your cut. You're going to do that with all 4 pieces, making sure that you have them face up, and you're lining up the 3-inch finished unit line. On the side, you want to trim away a little bit. So I'm going to end up with 4 of those. And be sure and shout out if you have a question, because if you have a question, you're probably not the only one that wonders, and we can answer for everybody. So there's my 4 left-leaning pieces. For my right-leaning pieces, all I have to do is flip this over and lay this on my cutting area face down. I'm still going to line up the 3-inch finished unit line on the base. I'm going to line up the dash line on the edge, and I'm going to trim away the part that I don't need. So there again is the part I'm not going to use. I'm going to save that part. I'm going to do that with all 4 of my units, half squares that are going to need to lean to the right. And by that I mean the units that are going to lean from the bottom left up to the top right. I'm just going to stack those up. Just make sure that every one of them is oriented the same way when you trim them, and I'll show you how to check them. I'm going to line up on that edge of the triangle, cut away the part I don't need, and just keep stacking. And I would probably check this before you cut all 4 of them, and this is how you're going to check it. You're going to just flip it over and make sure they are a mirror image. Let me grab 2 of them just so you can see it very clearly. There's my right-leaning one, and there's my left-leaning one. All I have to do now is add back the triangle of red that's going to go in the corner. So in order to get that triangle of red that I need, I'm going to do the step I would do if I was making a corner beam unit. I'm making this side triangle, and the way I get that piece is this bold line. It says it's the side triangle trim number 1 line. I'm going to use a 4-inch strip, because this is a 3-inch finished unit. So I've got my 4-inch strip here, and I have to have a mirror image. That's because I need a left and a right, and I need an equal number. So when I get these trimmed, I'm going to need 4 that lean left and 4 that lean right. So here's how I would do that. I've got my double strip folded back to back so that when I cut, I'm actually getting two of those side triangle units. So there's two. One's going on this stack and one's going on this stack. Then I'm just going to pick my whole tool up and twist it around until I find the second trim line and the seam placement line side triangle trim number 2. That second trim line goes on the very base of my strip, and that diagonal line goes on the edge where I cut the first pair of side triangles. This one goes on the left side, this one goes on the right side. And I just keep twisting back and forth until I have 4 replacement triangles. There's one, there's the other. Twist again, and you just twist all the way around till you find the second trim line. Line up the side triangle trim number 2 line on the diagonal edge and make your cut. And like I said, because we need both right and left, that makes this really super simple because you just have to cut them folded so you automatically get your mirror image that you're after. So now I'm ready to take these 2 stacks to the sewing area. So don't forget, if you have questions, holler at us so we can try to explain better. So there's my 2 finished units, just so you can see. Here's the stack of the right leaning where I've taken off the piece I don't need from this one, and I'm going to add this side triangle, and there's my left leaning one. So I've got those ready, and I would check them, make sure you're sewing the right one on the right side. So I am going to flip this over and sew the replacement triangle on the side. Now I like to sew with my base piece. That's the piece I trimmed away. Let me go over here so you can see. I like to sew with my base piece on top next to my presser foot. My side triangle that I'm adding goes on the bottom next to the feed dogs, and that helps feed it through. And I just kind of center that long seam on there. There may be a little ear sticking out here. There may be a little ear sticking out there. That's okay. You just want to kind of center it on there. I've never had one that I didn't have enough room to trim. This will probably be the one that I have a problem with. But I'm lining this up and I'm keeping tabs on this base unit because that one is already trimmed to size, at least the sliver. Of course I don't have any bobbin thread. See if we can get all the way across. Let me get rid of this and get a new bobbin real quick. And then, oh, I've got a bobbin. I just haven't closed the door. So there's my first replacement triangle. So that's what it's supposed to look like. I'm going to do that with all 4 of my left leaning. I'm just going to center it on there. Line that up. Let's sew off of a fabric tag. That'll make it easier. I couldn't figure out why I was out of bobbin thread already, but it could happen. Now, when I get to this seam allowance, I want to make sure that it stays pressed toward my blue sliver. So you may need a stiletto or you may need your handy dandy bent tip tweezers to hold that in place till you get it underneath the needle. Whatever it takes to be able to manipulate that and control it. So let me grab another one. Just center it on there. I tend to have a little ear sticking out on this end, just so I know it's going to cover what I need it to cover, and I have plenty of room for trimming. After you make a couple of these, you'll kind of have more of an idea of just how much room you need to leave at the ends. And here's my last one. I want the base piece on top. Always, if possible, you want the piece that's cut to size on the top and the oversized piece that's going to get trimmed on the bottom. It helps feed it through. It helps keep things nice and straight. when you do that. Now, here's the other pieces. Let me just get one of them. I think it's a little easier to see. There's my replacement triangle, and there's my base piece. And all I have to do is flip that over so that my base piece is on top. And again, you just want to center the replacement triangle on there and stitch along the edge of your base piece. Now on this, remember this unit is going to get trimmed, so I don't have to fuss with it. I do want to have as accurate a 1/4 inch seam allowance as I can, just to make it easier on me later, but you don't have to be real fussy because you're going to trim this to the right size. So I'm just lining up that along the edge, or stitching. So I'm going to do that 4 times. If you are more comfortable pinning this seam before you start stitching, that's perfectly fine. I tend not to, but there's nothing that says you can't. There may be a time when you want to press this open. You may want to press toward the sliver. I press toward the replacement triangle. And most of the time, if you buy a pattern that I have designed using sliver or that Deb has designed using the sliver technique, it's going to tell you which way to press. For these blockbuster units, sometimes they don't give you a pressing direction, but that lets you choose how you want to press. So I'm just going to cut these apart, take them to the ironing area, and we're going to press them, and then I'm going to show you how to trim them. So I want to trim that with the corner beam tool. I am going to, let me see if I can find my gray cutting mat. I think you'll be able to see that a little bit better than the blue one, the green one. So I'm going to press toward my replacement triangle, my red side triangle. I'm just going to give it a finger press. And I tend to stack them like this. And like I said, I've not had an issue having enough room. If you have an issue having enough room to trim, I would scoot down toward the base. I may not have left myself as much room as I would have liked. And I'm just going to set the iron on that, get the other ones ready, finger press them. Iron is slip sliding away. And there's my, I'm missing one, either that or I did an extra one over here. There it is. I had only 3 and I knew that there should be 4. Okay, now I have my 4th one. This is the time that you would use your acorn pressing solution if you're going to use that. And I would just give it a quick little swipe. And I tend to stack them. And I think you'll find that for the most part, that's enough solution and that they work just as well stacked as they do individually. I know some people like to do one at a time and push their iron, really push on the iron. I don't tend to feel like I need to do that, but if it works better for you and you get better results, that's what you want to do. Whatever gives you your best results. So I've got my 8 units. I have 4 lefties and 4 righties. So I'm going to trim these using this end of my corner beam tool. So a couple of things to look for. If you're left-handed, you're going to turn your tool so that these seam placement lines line up, pointing up to the top left. Since I'm right-handed, my seam placement lines are going to the top left, and I just slide this under. And once I get this in place, I'm looking for the tip of the sliver. The sliver is the one in the middle. or I guess it could be the one on the side, but I just count the middle one as the sliver. I want that intersection where the two lines crisscross to make sure that I've reserved that tip. And then all of these little points here should line up on the center seam so that I know I'm getting it straight when I trim. This is a 3-inch finished unit because you're going to have 4 units by 4 units. So I'm going to trim it to 3.5 inches. So there's my 3.5 lines. The number 3, this little tip here, that's the point of my number 3 unit. And I'm going to put that tip right at the very point of my sliver. I just wiggled it and then it's not in place. Once I get that in place, I'm also going to check up here and make sure that intersection is on that center seam and all my little tips points line up on that seam. So there's a left leaning unit. I'm sorry, a right leaning unit leaning from the bottom up to the top right. Line up the crisscross right on the tip. That puts this line on the seam here, puts the little points on the center seam, trim up and over, and you're going to be trimming this to 3.5 inches. So you see, you're not trimming a lot away, but can you imagine putting templates together to create this unit with this little sliver in the middle with that tiny sharp point? So that's the way you would trim the right leaning units. The left leaning units, you're still going to point the sliver to the top right corner. You're still going to find the intersection where the two lines crisscross. This line is going to line up on the seam, and I've almost not left myself enough room there. This line goes, all the tips go on the center seam, and I'll show you where you need to adjust so you don't have a problem. I have enough room, but barely, and I'll show you what I mean. This still has that crisscross meeting on the center seam. The number 3 tip is right at the point, and I'm going to trim up and over. And I had enough room, but see, all I cut off of the red was just a hair, a thread or two. When you line this up to do the replacement triangle here, pull this replacement triangle down more where you have more of an ear sticking out down here. This is less important because you're going to have plenty of room. See, I can trim away almost 3/8 of an inch here. I don't have that much wiggle room down here. In fact, I may have to reposition this. Let's just see what happens. And I can check this before I trim anything. See, the way I did this, I almost don't have enough room here. If I had moved this whole replacement triangle down further on the sliver, I would have an easier time to do that. I can make this work, but you shouldn't have to fuss with it if you pull that replacement triangle down toward the base of the sliver a little more. I was just getting ready to have a problem because you don't want that folded back when you trim. I've got all of my little points lined up on the seam. I've got my crisscross at the top of my sliver. I'm going to trim the first 2 sides. Again, I'm going to have just a thread or so on my red replacement triangle. When I get that trimmed, I still have enough room, but I would have a little more wiggle room if I had moved my side triangle down a little bit. So just a word of warning so that you won't have a problem. So that's how you're going to do the slivers. When you stitch these together, I would pin this and I would press this seam open. If you didn't want to do that, you could plan ahead and press half of them toward the background, half of them toward the blue sliver, and then they would nest. So you do have options to do that if you wanted to plan ahead and do that. So let's talk about our 2 colors of shaded 4-patch. So on this, I've got my pieces started. I'm going to have some squares stitched to a rectangle. So when you're doing these shaded 4-patch units, you're going to have a square sewn to a rectangle that becomes those triangles. That's what you're stitching. And then I'm going to do the opposite with my square and a rectangle that's going to become my small triangles. So my first step is to take my rectangles and squares and stitch them on the ends. And we're going to go back to the sewing area so I can walk you through that process. Now the shaded 4 patch is also a technique sheet. It actually gives you sizing information to do 24 sizes, because if you're using the Tecker Trimmer 3, you could make the shaded 4 patch in a 12-inch block, and it would be an interesting alternating block. So that is an option for you. So on this, I'm going to stitch my square on the end of my rectangle. And your instructions will tell you what size your squares and rectangles need to be. They are oversized so that you have room to trim later in the process. And you're going to do that for every shaded 4 patch unit you need. You need a square for the corner, and you need a rectangle. So I have 4 red ones and 4 blue ones so that I can have the number I need. Now I actually got a little bit of my selvage in here. You can tell that because it's a different color. Plus you can see the little holes. I know that's going to get trimmed off, so I'm not real worried about it. I'm just going to go ahead and use it. But normally you would not use selvage in your project. Of course, we know we're going to trim everything anyway. So it's not going to end up in my project, but you do want to be aware of that. And I'm just stitching a square on the end of all my rectangles. Now, the pressing on the shaded 4 patch is to help you later in the process. So you're going to want to press away from that square. Now, on the shaded 4 patch, there is a process you can use where you would sew a strip and another strip that's a little wider, and then cross cut those into these shapes. I find I go just as fast to cut the rectangles and sew them on. But there is if you had to make 100 of these, it might be much faster to stitch them in a strip set sort of a layout. So I'm pressing toward the rectangle, away from the square every time. So we're going to just finger press that, and finger press this one. Whoops, turned it over the wrong way. So I'm still pressing away from that square. We're going to give it just a little time under the iron, and my iron's hot. So I'm going to save the acorn pressing solution for a little bit later because I'm going to go on to the next step. I want to stitch together my units, and I call that my wonky 4 patch. I'm going to stitch so that the squares are on opposite ends of this rectangle, and that's my next step. Let me grab this because I'm going to need it in a minute. So my next step is to make my wonky 4 patches. It works better if all of them are oriented the same way. So I'm going to put my square on top as it feeds through, and I'm stitching down the long side, and I'm making sure that my seam stays the way I want it to stay. I'm going to adjust that and make it line up. Can't see my foot. There we go. Tony says she can't see my foot. So I'm lining up my square to go through first on top. We've done this before. This is not new. This is review. And it's a fun kind of a magical little trick. So I'm going to put the square of red on top, and shaded 4 patch in multiple colors, and kind of get a scrappy look. It's a quick way to make a project. I like to make them in 4 and 4.5 inch units because you can put together some really neat blocks with those units. But they also add some pizzazz to your corners of a 9 patch or a 4 patch block. So there's all kinds of things you can make with these magical triangles or shaded 4 patches. Where I got confused is there. Some people call them magical triangles, kitty in the corner. There's several names for this little unit. So there's my wonky 4 patch. That was what I was after at this point. Now, remember I said you always press away from the square. In order to do that, I'm going to fold this in half and I'm going to make a little clip there in the seam. I like to go a thread or so past that seam that I've stitched. And the reason is I can take this to the iron and it easily lays down the way I want the seams to go because I want to go away from the square. And I do that with all of my little wonky 4 patches, stitch or cut just a thread or two past the seam, and that helps them lay down flat when I go to press away from the square on this next step. So let me snip all of those and then we'll go to the iron and I'll show you what happens next. So these are ready to press toward the rectangle, and I can look at the back and see which way they're supposed to go and then give it a little finger press, set the iron on it, get the next one ready. I want to go toward the rectangle, and you can feel that with your fingers, whether you've got the seam going the way you want it to. When you make that little snip, it really wants to go that way, so you really don't have to fight it. Makes it much easier to lay down because the seams just naturally want to go that way. So this is the time that I would grab the acorn pressing pin and I would actually give it a little swipe on all the seams. Sometimes that's faster than doing the acorn pressing solution on every step because I can press them enough to get to the next seam I need to sew and then go back and do the acorn pressing solution on all of the seams that are affected. So this is my wonky 4 patches, and I'm going to show you what we do next with these. So any questions so far? Okay, Tony says no. I have, and I decided to do this over here because I think I can show you what you need to see a little better over here. I need to stitch on lines going across between these two squares. And of course I used thread that you can't see. Let's see if I can darken that up a little bit. I want to make sure that when I draw my lines that I'm going to stitch on are going to cross that intersection where the two lines cross, right there. So I'm just darkening them so you can see them. You will be able to see yours just fine. I'm not drawing them straight, but you can see how they crisscross. Right here is where my line of stitching needs to be. And in order to get the line going at an angle here, all I have to do is find a tool that has a 45-degree line. That 45-degree line, here's one right here, is going to go on the seam here. So if I line that up on the seam and make sure that I meet the corner right here, make sure you've got it on the 45, not the 30 or 60, then I can draw my line. And that's the angle that I want. Now, a couple of things to notice. It doesn't necessarily go to the corner. And then I'm going to turn it around, line up the 45-degree line again on the seam. I'm aiming for the intersection where it crisscrosses, and they may or may not be parallel. If you look at this, you can see it kind of goes at an angle, but I am guiding from this seam and from this seam. So I just go with what angle it shows me I need. I'm going to do the same thing. Now, that being said, I like to make this size up to a 4.5 inch finished unit because I can use my Tucker trimmer to draw those lines. All of the diagonal lines on the Tucker trimmer are 45 degrees. This one would be hard to work with, but I can put the 3.5 inch line on my seams. There's one, there's where it crosses over. Here's one, here's where it crosses over. And of course, you're not going to probably be drawing your lines on so darker so you can see them, but you'll be able to look for those. And I'm looking for where it crisscrosses, line that up and line up one of my 45-degree lines. All of the diagonal lines on a sucker trimmer are 45 degrees. It doesn't tell you that anywhere, so I'm just telling you. So line up right to that intersection, and I can almost not see my own line. It may or may not go to the corner. If it does, great. If it doesn't, don't worry about it because it's still going to work. Here's my lines. There's one of my seams. Here's my other seam. I'm aiming for the intersection right there, and I need to be on a 45-degree line. Once I get that in place, I'm going to draw my line, turn and line. Right there's my intersection. Line that up. I'm going to draw my line. Okay, so is everybody understanding that? I'll do one more. I've got time. We're going to line that up right there. We're going to turn, and there's my intersection. Line up one of my diagonal lines on the seam. And this one's kind of skimpy here. I don't know why. Sometimes that happens. There's no real rhyme or reason to why sometimes it's real thin there and sometimes it's not. Now I have my bigger rectangles here ready to pair them up with my wonky 4-patch. And you can tell on this particular project, I'm putting the opposite color in the corner than the big rectangle that's going to end up being my triangle. And I'm just going to layer those. Notice I did not have to layer my big rectangle on before I drew my lines. I can draw my lines and then I can just line those up and stitch. If you feel the need to pin, you certainly could. I'm aiming for that intersection right there. You'll be able to see it really well at your machine. You may not see it real well on my machine. So here's my next one. I want to buddy up the opposite colors. You could change your color combination and you might decide to match them, and that's fine too. You get to decide what colors you want to use. But in your cutting instructions, the little rectangle is going to end up being the small triangles. The square is going to end up being the corner, and the bigger rectangle is going to end up being your bigger triangle in your shaded 4-patch. You're just going to power sew through that assembly line style, line this up. There's my intersection, and I want to hit that intersection. I'm going to adjust that. That's how you get that nice sharp point on your shaded 4-patch corners. Once you get that done, here's that place where I had a little bit of my selvage on that smaller rectangle. It's going to get trimmed away. Nobody's ever going to know it but you. So we're going to line up. There's my intersection. It's kind of a mess where I've drawn it on there so you could see it. But I'm actually aiming for the intersection where the stitches cross. Once you get to the last section, then you're just going to sew across the end and come back the other way. One more stitch. I'm aiming for my intersection again. See how simple that is? It's all in the preparation, making sure your rectangles and squares are the proper size when you start. And you could create a really interesting alternating block in a 12-inch and a 7-inch. Anything larger than a 6-inch finished unit, you're going to need to use the Tucker Trimmer 3. When you get across the fourth one, then you're just going to park your needle, and we're ready to go trim these, press them, and cut them apart, press them, and then trim them to size. And I'll show you how we do that. So I'm going to the overhead camera so you can see the process I use. So here's our units. That's what I'm making. And I need to cut between these two lines. And I just grabbed my corner beam tool. Anything that is long enough to get across there. This actually happens to have a 1/4 inch line on the seam or on the tool. So there are going to be times that what you cut is, or what you end up with in this little channel is wider than a 1/2 inch. I just eyeball it and cut between. If this is a little wider than a 1/4 inch seam allowance, I don't worry about it because I'm more interested in the finished size than I am in how big the seam allowance is. If I was hand quilting, that might not be true. I might be a little bit more picky about it. But since I'm not going to hand quilt this, there's my shaded 4 patch in that color. Here's my shaded 4 patch in that color. And I'm going to press all of these toward the larger triangle. So we're just going to finger press it first. That's going to get your seams going the direction you want to go. And I just do little short strokes, stack them up in whatever order. Doesn't really matter because I'm going to trim all of them anyway. And do that to all of my units. Now this is also when you would use your acorn pressing pin on this section. I'm just going to do a few of them so you can see it. So I had it finger pressed. This is where you grab your acorn pressing pin, draw your line with your pin. I'm going to press another one of these because I think you'll be able to see the trimming better with it than you can with the big blue triangle. But you'll be able to see fine at home when you're cutting yours. So there's my shaded 4 patch units. I'm going to use my Tucker trimmer to trim those to size. So the Tucker trimmer is designed to trim half squares, combo squares, hourglass units, quarter squares, and you can trim the shaded 4 patch. Where it's particularly helpful is when you have a diagonal seam and a center point you want to maintain. On the hourglass unit, you actually have 2 diagonal seams, but you have a center point you want to maintain. So that's why this is the tool you want to use. So I'm going to line up my tool so that the half circle icon's on the top right, because this is a 3.5 inch unit. So I'm going to line up the 3.5 inch line on my seam. This line needs to go right through that point of my square. And when I get it in place, it's going to kind of disappear, but there's the line across. When I get that in place, I'm going to trim up and over. I'm going to turn 180 degrees. And again, I'm looking for the 3.5 inch cleanup lines. They're going to go on the cut edges. The 3.5 inch sizing line is going to go on my long seam, and my solid line is going to go right through the center of that corner of the square. So that's how I got my shaded 4 patch unit. So this is all I trim away, and see how easy that was. Let me do one with this one. Again, I'm looking for the 3.5 line, and it doesn't matter whether I line up this way. It really doesn't matter if I lined up this way. I'm looking for the intersection where the 3.5 line crosses over the bold solid line. That goes on the center point, and the diagonal line that's there is going to line up on the long seam. I can trim up and over, and you'll see when you make one of these how easy it is to find the line you're looking for. This is a 3.5 inch trimmed unit, so it'll finish at 3 inches. So that's how I know what to trim. So let's talk about how you assemble the pieces of your block. Let me move a few things out of the way and get my board over here, because I told you You don't have to assemble yours in the same manner that I did. So we're going to play with this for a minute. Let's put this one over here. And you can rearrange these pieces to whatever arrangement you want. If you should decide you don't want a 12-inch block, you can actually make this into a 6-inch block. If I took just slivers, you could get all the slivers that lean the same way. So this one leans a different way. That one leans the same way. Let me get a couple more. I've trimmed some of them. We're going to grab this one leans the same way. This one leans the same way. So there's 4 that lean the same way. This would be something you would need the slivers leaning the same way. And notice you can make a kind of a wonky little pinwheel out of that. That's just one arrangement. So you could do that. You can do the same thing with the shaded 4-patch units. So here's 4 shaded 4-patch units that match. And I could make a little pinwheel. I have to think about this. It would go this way. Ta-da! So there's a fun little pinwheel you can make out of it. You can make all of the squares go in. That would work better if some of them were a different color. So you have lots of options for what you do with your shaded 4-patch units, as well as what you do with your sliver units. And that's just one of the fun shapes you can make using the Tucker trimmer and the corner beam. So any questions so far? I don't have any questions. So don't forget, you can watch live. You can watch later on Facebook. If you can't find the video for the block you're looking for, you can find it on our YouTube channel. And go to our YouTube channel and subscribe. Then that way, every week when I post them, you'll be able to get a little note saying I posted something new. So next week, we will not have a video because it's the end of a holiday, and so the shop will be open on Tuesday, but we won't have a sew-along video, and so I will, it'll be on Facebook when we have our next one, and we'll be doing block number, I don't want to tell you the wrong number, 37. We're skipping one. Remember, we're skipping the blocks that don't fit easily in a 12-inch arrangement, and the ones that use the specialty star tools, the wedge star, the star 60, the Lemoyne star, those kinds of tools. They're a lot of fun to use, but that is something that we're just skipping. So until next week, happy sewing. Come see us, and we'll see you 2 weeks from now, live at 5.